All right. Well, good afternoon again. As promised, we're here with Jane Connors, who is the UN's first victim rights advocate. We were in the Central African Republic with the Secretary General. We thought it'd be a good moment for Jane to come and finally meet you. So, Jane, all yours.
It's really a pleasure for me to be here today. You all know that I had the privilege of taking up this position, which I can say is very challenging, on the 14th of September 2017. And I participated in the high-level meeting on prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse on the 18th of September. Since that time, I've been meeting with states, UN colleagues, and other stakeholders, listening to their ideas and concerns. And as you know, I spent almost 2 weeks in the Central African Republic. And there I was in Bangui, Bambari, and Bangassou, with MINUSCA colleagues, representatives of agencies, funds and programs, local actors, including government, judges, and civil society. I was part of the Secretary General's visit to the country and met with victims of sexual exploitation and abuse. You all know that I'm the first prong of the full-pronged strategy of the Secretary General to address SEA system-wide. I will act as an advocate, and I'm already acting as an advocate for those most at risk by identifying ways to prevent this inhumane behaviour and, if it occurs, promote and protect the human rights and dignity of those victims. My priority is to give visibility to those who have suffered, including through connecting with them personally. And I wish to amplify their voices in a way that cannot be ignored and support them as they rebuild their lives. In addition to ensuring that there are reliable gender-sensitive pathways for every victim or witness to file complaints, I'll work to ensure that assistance is rapidly and sensitively delivered. I will work as I did in CAR with state institutions, civil society, including national human rights institutions and legal aid organisations, to craft networks of support and assist and to ensure that the full effect of local laws are brought to bear. And I'm not looking at a blank canvas because there are best practices that have been developed by member states, NGOs and others to address victims' rights. We have 4 field victims' rights advocates, and I will be working with them very closely. They are based in the areas from which the majority of allegations emanate. One is in Minijust in Haiti, one is in MINUSCA, CAR, MONUSCO, DRC, and UNMISS, South Sudan. Going forward, there will be advocates appointed in other humanitarian and development contexts where the incidence of SEA calls for them. They are actually the people who maintain the direct and regular contact with the victims so that their needs with respect to legal accountability are addressed and to follow the status of their cases so they are informed. And that's one of the issues that is very important. Often victims don't know what has happened to their cases, and this is a priority for us. I'm in close contact with those 4 people, and during my time in Central African Republic, Nathalie Benzakourman was with me throughout my visit. The tools that have been developed have been described to you by Stefan, so I won't go into them again. But I think with regard to the trust fund, that provides a great potential. It will be for the development of imaginative projects which truly place the victims at the centre of our work. So that's enough from me. I'm very happy to take questions and very happy to interact with you in any other context.
Good, thank you. Edie?
Thank you very much, Edith Lutteroff from the Associated Press on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association. Welcome.
Thank you.
Could you give us some specifics of your contacts in CAR? Did you talk to victims? What specific kinds of help is the UN offering? We hear about psychosocial support. What about money? What about education opportunities? What actually is the UN going to specifically be offering to them?
I did talk to victims in the Central African Republic. and I did speak to them about their wishes and needs and aspirations, and how they saw their lives going forward. With regard to assistance, immediate assistance, such as psychosocial support or medical assistance, food, etc., is provided to anyone who comes forward and complains or alleges sexual exploitation and abuse. And that the allegation doesn't have to be proven at that stage. It can proceed, and of course, as the allegation goes forward, other support is provided. With regard to those victims that I met in the Central African Republic, they had all been provided with and are continuing to be provided with psychosocial support, which is administered through partners on the ground. So UN entities work with partners so that that psychosocial support can be provided. They also receive, in some contexts, education and given opportunities for education and the development of income-generating activities themselves. To me, there was a lot more that needs to be done, especially with regard to education. And I found that a significant risk is lack of education, not only because schooling is protective, but also because those who have no education are much more at risk. They're not as able to be informed. So I think that is an area which requires significant attention. And when I talk of this trust fund, and I encourage donors to look at that trust fund in a warm and gentle way and contribute even more, it would be very useful to consider imaginatively the sorts of projects that you might establish. When you're looking at education, it's difficult for young women to go back to school if they've never been schooled, for example. There are other challenges as well, lack of birth certificates, and the general challenge that creates vulnerability, significant vulnerability, or risk, I don't like to say vulnerability, for individuals.
As a quick follow-up, how much money is in this trust fund right now, and what are you seeking?
It's $1.5 million, I believe. So we would be seeking more contributions, and contributions could be made by member states and others, individuals, and of course foundations and so on and so forth. There is a similar fund, of course, as you know, with regard to victims of torture, and that has been ongoing for some years. It has a particular donation from the United States, as you know, annually. And it has funded very interesting projects for the rehabilitation of victims of torture, legal assistance, income, sort of those sorts of things. So I'm thinking that this is an area that could be explored, and the focus should be rebuilding the lives of these people, and of course seeking justice for them, ensuring that their cases can go forward.
Thank you. Carol, and then Matthew.
Hi, I'm Carol Landry with Agence France Presse. In Central African Republic, MINUSCA has the highest incidence of SEA cases. So in meeting with the victims, I'm wondering, were you able to gain any insight as to what's going on there, that there are more cases than elsewhere, and in the situation of these victims, were there certain patterns, certain things that are recurring that should be addressed?
Well, to be clear, I was only there 11 days, and with regard to meeting with victims, and I wish to say that we wish to see victims turn into survivors. It requires a lot of sensitivity and also complete confidentiality. So those I met on with their support and one-on-one. So it wasn't a sort of group of victims that I was talking to with respect to their situations. I spoke to about their aspirations and their feelings and what they wanted. I wasn't investigating patterns and so on. But with regard to the Central African Republic, what I can say is that I was extremely impressed by the absolute commitment of the SRSG, the absolute commitment of the force commander and the police commissioner, and and colleagues generally to turn things around. And there are significant measures that are being put in place to ensure that everybody is aware that sexual exploitation and abuse is totally unforgivable and not to be tolerated in any way, shape, or form. There are clear frameworks put in place, and that commitment, and it does take leadership. The leadership is essential, and it mirrors the leadership of the Secretary-General in putting forward this strategy that he has in terms of addressing it. Training, I think, training has to be recurrent, and it has to be aimed at changing the mindset, because sadly we're seeing that this sort of conduct is not confined. This sort of conduct is more common in other contexts. Obviously, sexual exploitation and abuse within the UN definition is of a different kind, but we need to be consistently vigilant and really work to ensure that the victim is really not lost through all of this. So there's not multiple requirements of reporting, and you spoke of the incident reporting form, which should be able to facilitate this, to make sure that evidence isn't compromised, because the more you interview somebody, the more you compromise their testimony, because there's clearly an indication, it can clearly be alleged that they've been coached. The victims didn't reflect on the nature of they were young, very young, they were all under the 18 or under, and so the conversations were different, and the conversations were as to what they felt, what they wanted, and their aspirations for the future.
Thank you. Matthew?
Sure. Matthew Lee, Inner City Press, on behalf of the Free UN Coast for Access. Thanks for the briefing. I wanted to know, I'd asked here during that trip by the Secretary General and your team in the CAR about the independent panel's report, the 111-page report about sexual abuse in CAR and the Compass matter, and whether Mr. Renner Onana, who was one of only 3 officials named in the report as having played a role in covering up the sexual abuse of children, was still there. It emerges, I guess, that he was actually promoted. I don't know if you saw him while you were there, and I guess I want to ask, what do you, as a victims' right advocate, do you think that there's at least a need for the UN to explain, given its own report? Babacar Gueye was fired. Ms. LaPont is gone. What follow-through was there on that? And also, Code Blue did a pretty damning press conference where they talked about the actual victims of that round and found that very few had been helped at all, that they went back and re-interviewed people. And I'm just wondering, is there anything now that you have the position that you can do to even track those victims down and make sure that even at this remove, that they're not left without any recourse? And I had one last, I meant to ask Stefan this, but he kind of ran quickly off the podium. It seemed that the numbers, 36 victims, 72% women, 19% girls, it didn't seem to add up to 100, and maybe I'm missing, or what you, then you
No,
just...
I think the rest are unknown in terms of whether they're 17 or under, or 17 or 18 or over.
Age unknown.
Yeah,
Okay.
age unknown, yeah.
Because they mightn't have birth certificates,
Yeah.
which is a big issue.
Okay.
And that is a big issue with regard to the nature of the crime, of course. I joined recently, so I joined on the 14th of September, and I'm unfamiliar with the fate of the people that you're speaking, not the victims, but certainly the personalities that you might be talking of. And I will, of course, look at victims generally, but going forward, and also those historical cases. But with regard to the specifics of the follow-up of the CAR panel report, which is, of course, an independent report rather than a UN report, that would be something I could leave to Stefan.
I mean, I guess given that you're taking this job, have you read the report, and what do you think of the UN's? I mean, I understand you're going forward, and I mean, do you think that the UN has still some duty, whether or not you began the job in September? If it's the case, which seems to be the case, that all of these people were sexually abused or exploited by the UN, there's no, whether it's through you or through someone else, is there no provision to try to? It's nice to do well going forward, but what about that?
Well, certainly with regard to the victims, and I have read the CAR panel report, but some time ago, certainly with regard to the victims, but with regard to those who were touched on in the report, I was not part of the UN at that point of time. But certainly, clearly, the needs of those who have experienced sexual exploitation and abuse is the focus of my work. And where there is something that the United Nations can do in this context, I will make sure that, or I will do my best. I will put my efforts where they should be, so it goes forward. And of course, many of the allegations we're looking at allegations that might, maybe with regard to incidents which are not fresh, because as the systems become more appropriate for the victim, as you'll see in domestic systems, you'll have more reportage, which is a good thing. I mean, it's a good thing that there are incidents, but it is a good thing that those feel that there may be a resolution to their situation, that their lives can go forward, and they can seek some form of accountability.
And I would add on the CAR panel report, I think all of that report and others have informed the Secretary General's vision in tackling the issue, and I think you're seeing the result of that in Jane's appointment and in the greater transparency that we have. Yes, in the back.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Zainab Mohammed Saleh. I'm from Sudan. Are you planning to go to Darfur? There are always stories in the media that women raped. Like 2 days ago, a little girl, 16-year-old, was raped by Janjaweed. So do you have plans of going there and meet the victims?
My role is specific. I'm not ducking your question. My role is specific with regard to sexual exploitation and abuse, which is perpetrated by those under the UN flag. So I do have plans to go to South Sudan, where I would be in the mission. And there is going to be, clearly I will go anywhere that I will, where there is sexual exploitation and abuse within the definition of my role. And I'm very aware of the fact that other exploitation and abuse, sexual assault by others, and we have the situation where we know that also NGOs working with beneficiaries might be engaged in this sort of conduct. This is an atmosphere that does bleed in to a certain extent into the perpetration of these crimes by those who are UN personnel. So I have a plan to go to South Sudan, but my role will not be victims writ large, but I know that in my work I will be confronted with situations of victims writ large.
Carol.
In terms of, you mentioned that sometimes the victims don't get information about what's happening. So in your role, will you be asking, for instance, a TCC to report to you what is happening with case X? Because that's been an issue, as you know.
There is reportage of what's happening with case X, but certainly I want to systematize that because, of course, they ask, the victims ask, well, several didn't, but the more educated ones did. What's happened to my case? So I want to put in place a very systematic method of being able to inform those whose cases are ongoing as to where the case has got to, and of course the challenge will be talking about cases that are not successful.
Right, but I mean. With the TCC, if you make a request to a troop contributing country for information, they would have to respond to your request because...
Well, I hope that the TCC would respond, but I will work on something a little more systematized so we can get that information. The TCCs have been fairly cooperative and collaborative with providing that information, but then we need to have a follow-through so it goes in the right way to the victim concerned.
Thank you very much, Jane. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you very much.